Did you have any idea in terms of, you know, what we were about to do and launch prior to launching the practice?
No, I
Mm.
mean, I do. Put it this way, you walked into like an alligator mouth with two rows of teeth, because not only were you staking claim to a word that has so much breadth and so many people are so invested of in, so already you're going to have just like territorialness and like who owns that and we own that and why are you
Mhm.
talking about culture, but then your point of view about it was also deeply threatening to a lot of practitioners who actually wanted it um, to be a separate thing.
Yeah,
That's sort of the new general market, or what,
the
if
new
I'm getting those
majority.
words wrong.
Yeah, in the
The new
new general
majority.
market, yeah, and it's gone back and forth, right, in terms of the taxonomy.
But that's, that was threatening to a lot of people who didn't want to think of it in a broader holistic sense, because they were making a ton of money,
Hmm.
parsing it off on the side and saying like, no, 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 you got to do Hispanic marketing on its own, or you got to do that on its own.
The big question: how quickly can brands and businesses change and modernize in response to the changing demographics globally? The future of work, demand for modernizing the practice of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and industry corrections. This is why we started the Change Podcast by Reframe, to help people leaders like you get answers that accelerate inclusive change and growth that reflects where the world is going. Get ready as we host a discussion with people leaders faced with the same challenges and modernize their approach to solving a decades-old problem. I'm your host, Jeffrey L. Bowman.
The title for episode 2, Betting on the Future, the first cultural agency. In this episode, I interview Charlie McKittrick, Chief Strategy Officer at Mother Industries, an independent creative agency. And we explore the evolution of the advertising industry from traditional methods to digital transformation. We discuss his journey into advertising, starting the first cultural agency, OgilvyCULTURE, and the challenges of integrating multicultural marketing strategies within a general market agency. The conversation highlights the importance of understanding audience dynamics and the need for a holistic approach to marketing in a rapidly changing landscape. We discuss the evolving landscape and the importance of diverse talent. Last, we reflect on the industry's progress as well as setbacks. Join me. I'm excited to dig in and learn more about Charlie. When we originally started thinking about the theme for this season, it was really about the remaking or more or less revisionist history of Reframe the Marketplace, the total market approach to the new majority. And when we were thinking about who could we get as guests, was really important is that we went all the way back to the beginning, even before writing or publishing the book, just to get some the tone of what was happening in 2009, 2010. And the person who I had to have on the season was a person by the name of Charlie McKittrick. Um, I'm not going to steal a lot of his thunder, but Charlie was the person that brought me into the advertising industry. And so, in so many ways, if it were not for Charlie, this book would not exist. And so, the way that we start with all of our guests is, we're not going to read you a huge bio and well credentialed. So, Charlie, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the show. And let's start off by getting a little understanding of who you are and how did you get into the business?
All right. Thank you. Good to see you. Thanks for having me on. I'm sure you would have written the book even without that fortuitous moment on at Ogilvy and Mather, and maybe the book would have even been better. But we'll just assume not. I don't know. I mean, I'm terrible at introducing myself, as anybody who knows me has known. I think the short answer is I've always been interested in the relationship between creativity and business. I think that that's really what's interesting. I'd spent a couple of years in just the film business, and even just running my own or with other people, but in a sort of a creative design business, but not understanding the business as well as I wanted to, and not understanding my clients as well as I wanted to. So then I went to business school, and then quite honestly, somebody developed an internship at Ogilvy and Mather, and then they went off to Europe to take another internship, and was like, "Does anybody else want my sloppy seconds?" And I was like, "Yeah, I will. That sounds fascinating." And then Ogilvy was sort of the perfect place because it was, and especially in that era, in the sort of the 2000s and on, because it was sort of when advertising was trying to catch up with business.
Mm-hmm.
So they were hiring a bunch of people who understood business, and were trying to develop all of those marketing strategy skills, consulting skills, CRM, database management, analytics. So anyway, I ended up at Ogilvy and Mather for over a decade.
Yeah.
And that's where I met you.
Before we get past that, I mean, where'd you grow up at, and how much of influence where you grew up, and how did that play into getting into the film business? Because I don't want to bypass that part, because I think that's a pretty critical piece in terms of understanding creative, the industry, and then, trying something and then trying something else after that. And that's a lesson learned for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. It's actually funny. I don't know if you remember this, but I remember you were sort of the mentor to like a large group of people, and it was a structured system at Ogilvy, and you were helping them think about their future and roadmap their future. And again, it was like prime, it was like square, like millennial, when everybody was like, oh my God, there's this new generation, they think differently. And the whole conversation was about like understanding where your objective was and what you wanted to do and mapping out steps to get there. And I remember sitting in that meeting and thinking like, oh, I would have been kicked out. Like Jeffrey wouldn't have mentored me, because I don't do that. As much as I still get paid to this day to be strategist for large multinational clients, like for myself, I've never been structured in my pursuit. So my short answer is I'd studied philosophy. I grew up in DC.
Yeah.
I went to Tufts University. I studied philosophy. They accidentally happened to have probably the best undergraduate philosophy department in the country. And so I was really interested in philosophy, but then I didn't want to become an academic. At the last minute, I sort of thought, oh, I want responsibility. I want to be able to do something. And so, but a bunch of my professors had made films for the BBC and for, PBS about philosophical concepts. And I was like, oh, that's so interesting. Like I could actually take philosophy out into the world, because it's about making sense of the world. And I was like, why should just the academics be making sense of the world? Because all of us have to live in it.
Yeah.
So I got into filmmaking, and then I thought, oh, filmmaking is really fun, and I chased it.
Yeah.
And I mean, I did it both, academic documentary style, but I also did sort of like shallow, creative, fun, commercial style, and then found my way to LA. But then again, I was sort of like, I ran into a guy named Adrian Belichescu, and sort of, became partners with him, and we started a design studio. Yeah. And so that was, that's sort of how I got into it, because I think, the transition is that I do think like filmmaking was super fun and I enjoyed it, and design was fun, and there was a lot of digital media stuff, but I didn't understand the business side. And I think whereas philosophy is about making sense of the world, business school is about making sense of a capitalist world, and we happen to live in a capitalist world. So I think that's why I went to then business school, because I was like, oh, well, now I need to make sense of that. So that's how I led to it. And I think that's, to me, that's the sort of the balance of the two.
No, and it really does play out in terms of the thinking too. I can remember I'd maybe been at Ogilvy. I think it was a new business pitch, and it's like, hey, come hang with me for a little bit. And then we went into a meeting. It was a new business pitch, and I started talking about all the numbers. And you said, hey, you're gonna scare the creatives. Let's like change the approach a little bit. But I think it was really insightful in terms of, how do you transition in terms of storytelling in a simple way? And I think that's probably one of the biggest things I took away from my experience at Ogilvy. I think at the time, the industry was at somewhat of a crossroad, from traditional, television, radio, out of home, print, to digital, and then some will say you had the bean counters, the consultants coming in. For the people that, if you had to like paint a picture of that time frame, I could remember being in the elevator. There were old creatives that were like, I don't know what I'm going to do next. This digital stuff, no one wants to, paint pictures. All they want are digital stuff. Just kind of paint the picture in terms of you starting your group, you recruiting for your group, and then what was Ogilvy like at that particular time?
Yeah. Okay. Great question. It's funny because it was such a fascinating era, but you also didn't know it at the time. It's like looking back on it, I was like, oh my gosh, what an incredible period of time, because it was exactly that. It was this transitional era from old simple advertising, driven creative, to then this like, oh, there's digital and accountability and sophistication and analytics and CRM. They were just trying to figure it out. And there was a sort of a little bit of a power struggle in Ogilvy and Mather, because the side of the business that was trying to get smarter was growing and becoming more powerful. But then the side of the business that was the core of the brand, which was about creativity. And I think, the thing I love about just the classic DNA of advertising is just the ambition and the high level thinking and the ambition for their clients and where clients can go. But then that was sort of the tension that was going on. And I think advertising operates on simplicity. And so there was also a big tension between sort of like the simplicity of like large scale, old school, ambitious advertising, and then the complexity of this new era that just had all these little pieces and all these different things and all these technicalities. And I think starting the group, so it's like there was sort of a series of small groups that then sort of got put together. And then I've never given Bruce Leibowitz the credit that he deserves for basically giving me my job after a series of absences to sort of like take over what was.
And what was Bruce's role at that time? Who's Bruce?
Bruce Leibowitz, he was actually, his specialty was telemarketing.
Okay.
And the complexity of the structures and sort of the conversational cadence of, sophisticated call centers. And actually, with brands like Amex, you have one series of exposures to that brand that you see on TV, and then you have another series of exposures that you have when you're calling and asking about your bill and booking a flight and looking for travel. And I think there was a good insight Ogilvy had, which is like, those 20 phone calls that you make can just be just as brand building as the ad that you see. Why don't we get good at helping clients mold that and make it good? And that's what Bruce was so good at. But in a series of sort of just like internal structural changes, Bruce had been put in charge of a couple of bits and pieces that had been, this sort of consulting group. But it had, analytics and, database marketing and a bunch of things in it. And he gave it to me. He sort of like shepherded it. He got it in good shape, sort of post transition. But he was like, look, this isn't my specialty. This is your specialty. So why don't you take it, and help make something of it? So again, I've never given him full credit for that. But it was a very confident management move that he made. Anyway, so then I took it on, and then I think this is probably going to be the theme of our conversation, Jeffrey, which is, Ogilvy is a culture of specialization, but my instincts are about integration.
Yeah.
And so I think that was both the exciting part and the struggle of the next couple of years, because I sort of wanted to bring analytic thinking and brand thinking and marketing thinking and advertising thinking into cohesion.
Right.
Because I think that that's what clients want, and that's how to create client value. But Ogilvy just had a culture of just specialization. Right. Just be like, oh, that guy's really good at social media. That's a social media department. That person, that's really good at digital. That's a digital department. That person's really good at analytics. That's an analytic department, which I think gets a lot to like some of your thinking about cross-cultural marketing.
Right.
Anyway, that was the tension. So I was sort of like trying to bring it all together, and they were into it. But I think at the end of the day, it was a clash of, perspectives.
Right. Before, what I like about, what you're describing, and I think it is part of the theme, from a time frame perspective, you're probably talking about, 2007, 2008, 2009.
Yep.
There was huge transformation within the industry. And this For the beginning of the episode is a little bit of, insider ball game, and you may not be as familiar with the advertising and marketing industry. So some of the terminology may be a little bit foreign, but I think the picture that we're trying to paint was that everything was changing from in terms of how we told stories, what type of stories that were being told. And on top of that, I think for the first time, the industry was grappling with the fact, right around the corner was this 2010 census. You had people coming into the business making the picture smarter from an effectiveness and performance standpoint. And then the audience was shifting. And so, one of the chapters in the early beginnings, I think it was chapter 2 in the book, is about the source of growth. A lot of the work that we were doing was really figuring out what's the growth opportunity and then bringing those tools together. And, I came on board probably, for a couple of years, and then we started with the idea of like, hey, there's this thing around culture. There's this thing around general market multicultural. And there's a presumed inequity associated with it. And, myself, Donna Pedro, who was chief diversity officer at the time, John Seifert was the president of Ogilvy North America, went to them with this idea of like, hey, there's an opportunity here in terms of like, if we have these ERGs, how do you create value for the agency in terms of, going beyond just an internal group? And so I wanted to provide context from the industry standpoint, because sometimes from outside looking in, when you have new ideas, it's not always the best timing from a prioritization standpoint, right? And you explained it very well. Ogilvy had all these specialty groups. Then, I came back to you. I said, hey, I want to take this on. And I think you said, that's great, but as long as it's like not your day job. So can you talk a little bit about, the idea of starting as you did, a new practice, but the idea of general market multicultural. Prior to me talking to you about that tension, how much of that was on your radar at the time? And I'll tell you why I'm asking the question. After your response, how much of that was on your radar?
Okay. Well, because so much of it again was, I think, advertising had just had an era of sort of post roll up holding company. It was a golden era, but it was very simple. It was very big. The margins were huge. The cash generation was fantastic. And then all of a sudden, this new change era was increasing complexity of the system of marketing, and everybody was trying to get a grips of it. And I think a lot of what I was doing was to build out the pieces around advertising that were important to it. Mm-hmm. So it was about helping Ogilvy and Mather get better at the job it was that they were doing for their clients. And I think a little bit helping the clients understand what the job it was that they needed to be doing in order to have a full marketing system. To your point, Jeffrey, it's like, who are we going after? How are we going to get them? Where's the growth going to come from? What kinds of things do they need to hear? What kind of brand do we need to be? Where does that show up? Like what I would consider to be a holistic marketing system, whereas advertising had spent decades just doing one piece of it. And all of a sudden we had to build out all of these other pieces. And that was the tension and the struggle and the transition. And I remember, it's so funny because if anybody who knows me, aside from knowing that I'm terrible at introducing myself, knows that I have a terrible memory. But to your credit, Jeffrey, I remember the interview with you. And I remember the room. It was one of these like little tiny like boothy rooms that they had. And there was a whiteboard and like a low couch. And I just remembered like you'd done time at Pepsi, you'd done time at Miller, you had client side experience, but you knew distribution, you knew trade, you knew what the coal face of marketing was. Mm-hmm. And in the middle of the interview, you got up and You were drawing
Yeah,
something on the whiteboard to do it, which is obviously catnip for me because
we love that.
I like charts and visuals help me. But I think you know what I mean. That's when it was my attraction to you was just that it was so such a whatever overlap with the
Hmm.
mission, which is just bringing that skill set, that perspective, that depth of I mean the idea of channels and distributions like that had never nobody really worried about that in advertising before, and all of a sudden we had to understand that stuff. um, and I think in terms of the cross cultural stuff, I mean I think it was I mean it was it's funny because it was also the era of segmentation,
Right.
and that a lot of what the analytic group and a lot of what the marketing strategy was focused on was creating segmentations.
Hmm.
And I mean I think you point out in the book and in your practice, up till that era, segmentations weren't doing the work they were doing because you weren't
It
polling
wasn't
all of
inclusive.
the right people.
Yeah.
It wasn't inclusive. You didn't know how to ask the right questions. And the people analyzing the data and then acting on the data
Yeah.
didn't, you know what I mean? Didn't know how to do it and didn't know how to act on it. And so I think, when you then started talking about, cross cultural marketing and whatever a little bit just because what in the new multicultural what was
Yeah.
so intriguing about it was you were making the observation that we've sort of siloed it off, we've given it to these specialty people, they don't have the money or the resources or what I mean, they
Scale.
aren't charged with the brand ambition that we're charged with. So let's understand that. But what made sense to me, I think, intuitively was if I did a segmentation,
Hmm.
race or ethnicity should never actually be a segmentation driver. I mean, it could be if we
It's an
wanted it to,
input.
but
Yeah.
it's an input. It's
Yeah.
if you actually field it correctly and you
Yeah.
get the distribution right and you analyze it with people who know how to analyze it and you ask the questions, it should actually cut across everything because you're actually looking at higher order, behaviors and attitudes and
Yeah.
themes and values and instincts. So anyway, so then when you know what I mean, like your particular approach to it, I think had a lot of intuitive sense to me because it actually matched the kind of segment based
Right.
thinking that we were doing. But you were also, pointing out, I think what we knew, but we probably didn't want to tell ourselves
Yeah.
is that there were some hard conversations to be had about how we were doing it and what was lacking in all of it.
Yeah. I think, you know, what what was interesting in our conversation, you talked about, you had a sponsor, Bruce Leibowitz. You were my sponsor at Ogilvy in starting, Ogilvy Culture because there was anytime you're starting something new, specifically within an agency, and you talked about it, you know, at the end of the day, it's going to make money from a P&L perspective. Hence, why you have a lot of specializations. I think the other piece, insightful, if it if we didn't have the group that we had, then it would have been hard to articulate the value piece because of the age of segmentation. And with the segmentation is the value of these segments in terms of prioritization and what do they mean to you. And so I think with the group that we had, highly strategic focus, starting, Ogilvy culture with the idea of going from mono to multi to cross, we just didn't have proof of concept, right? And so a lot of stuff that you guys showed me in terms of the thought leadership piece played into framing up the thesis. And so that was done at night while doing the strategy job in the daytime. And that went on, in 2009. I think I came to you in like the spring and then the summer. We started putting the packaging together and then we had to take it to Seifert and the leadership team with Donna to say, hey, here's the thing in terms of our offering. Here's the thing in terms of what we think we can do in terms of, driving value with this new practice. We just didn't know what to call it, right? And I'm chuckling because as we got ready to go into 2010, classic Ogilvy, we wanted to kind of announce to the world. I had no idea what I was walking myself into in terms of the belly of the beast, choosing the ANA Multicultural Conference. Ogilvy shows up and Ogilvy had never really had a role at that conference. And then we're going to present the fact that we're launching a new practice called Ogilvy, and there's culture attached to it. And I don't know if you remember, but there was a lot of tension between global CEO and North America CEO because Ogilvy in itself, as it relates to culture, it's kind of like very protected, and there wasn't a lot of alignment between global and North America. And so, when you talk about the age of segmentation, that was a pretty tricky time, meaning a general market agency going to a multicultural conference. And I don't think a lot of people at Ogilvy kind of knew that type of tension and what we were walking into. Did you have any idea in terms of, what we were about to do and launch prior to launching the practice?
No, I
Yeah.
mean, I do. Put it this way, you walked into like an alligator mouth with two rows of teeth because not only were you staking claim to a word that has so much breadth and so
Yeah.
many people are so invested in, so already you're going to have just like territorialness and like who owns that and we own that and why are you
Hmm.
talking about culture? But then your point of view about it was also deeply threatening to a lot of practitioners who actually wanted it um, to be a separate thing.
Yeah.
That's sort of the new general market, or what,
The
if
new
I'm getting those
majority.
words,
Yeah. In
the
the
new
new general
majority.
market, yeah. And it's gone back and forth, right? In terms of the taxonomy.
But that's, that was threatening to a lot of people who didn't want to think of it in a broader holistic sense because they were making a ton of money,
Hmm.
parsing it off on the side and saying like, no, 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 you got to do Hispanic marketing on its own, or you got to do that on its own. So yeah, so no, I had no idea. I apologize. I
No,
would
no,
have
no.
tried to save you from at least one row of teeth. But I think that that's what's, I don't know. That's again what I think was so great about your offering, so brave about it. And I think, you have a quote which, I know it's in the book, but I think it's more than that, which is your approach was, hey, do you want to feel good,
Yeah.
or do you want to build a business?
Right.
And for me, even the build a business is code for, do you want to drive an outcome? You know what I mean? And it just happens. I mean, this is we can debate about the pros and cons of, modern capitalism. But one of the good things about capitalism is it drives outcomes.
Hmm.
And I think that that's what's, when you say build a business, it's not necessarily because you're greedy.
Yeah.
Though I do think you're a good capitalist, but I think you know what I mean? Like, that's what I love about your approach, which is like, oh, we can do a bunch of stuff and we can like create a department over there that pretends to be about, fixing these problems or addressing these conversations that we don't want to have. Or we can like bring it in and we can actually drive outcomes.
Hmm.
And I think that whatever, which is, all the more problems for you,
Yeah.
Jeffrey, as a business owner, but I think all the better for the world because it's an approach that has more impact.
Yeah. No, I'm glad we spent a little bit of time in terms of, talking about, the idea of, general market and multicultural, the age of segmentation, because I think for some new to this conversation, even today, um, it's heavily, in the beginning, it's a heavily quantitative approach because you're uncovering not only insights but value in some cases to, you know, brands that have had an unlimited amount of resources, but they don't have the data as it relates to these, diverse audience segments. And so, when people come into the conversation, into the practice, and I don't think people knew at that time, 2010, when we did do the announcement of the practice, like it was, I wouldn't say it was yet to be proven, right? And so you think about 2010, 2011, we got IKEA, and then we got a couple other brands. Then we were able to like validate their approach in itself. And that was 2012, 2013. And I ended up leaving the group. We're doing day to day with Ogilvy Culture. there was still tension organizationally, mainly because of how the outcomes cut across different offerings, but also cut across, different audiences, right? And for some of those audiences, even though as you're building a brand, as you are building a strategy, you're supposed to have insight. Sometimes it's hard to articulate what those insights are if you're not that close or adjacent to that audience in itself. And that was the beauty about working with Ogilvy. You had a very diverse employee base to where, I think one of our biggest campaigns was British Airways. And I can remember, with British Airways, it was Visit Mum. And, we had a very dynamic team that was South Asian within the building in itself. We had Shagufta, we had Divya, and a number of different people that just happened to be working. And that gets to the talent piece of having a diverse talent base. And so when you look at that and you look at, flash forward, we validated, we grew it, to a single digit $1 million practice. I get lifted out and now I'm going across the organization, and then you leave. You leave me, man, on the island. What was that transition like, leaving Ogilvy to become, at the time, I think, Chief Strategy Officer at Mother? How much of that experience did you take with you? And then as you reflect, how much did it form, or did it inform, of how you went to work and did your work? And then after you answered it, I got a bigger question in terms of, has the industry changed at all since that time frame? So let's start with, you left me, you abandoned me.
I know. I apologize for that. There was actually, it was terrible because there were actually like two other people who I literally, it's just one of those like terrible overlap, like rifts in the universe that happen, occasionally, that I'd recruited while I was exiting. And, they literally like, and one guy was like from McKinsey, like these were like, hard to get, hard to recruit people. And literally like the week that they started, I was like, sorry, I'm going. So I apologize for that. I think, again, it's this sort of like specialization versus general, was just at a certain point, I could just see the writing on the wall. The organization didn't want to bring things together. Yeah. They, it just liked specialization better. And the politics of that just became, the amount of time you spent playing chess versus delivering value to clients or being creative, it was just, ridiculous. And so yes, I went to Mother, which was an independent agency. And actually at that point I was just the head of strategy, and I was actually co-head of strategy with a gentleman named Phil Graham, who was a great partner. But I think the part about that I took with me, I think there's two parts. The one that I took with me, and what I love about Mother, now I'm the CSO and a managing partner of Mother. But what I like about Mother is that the conversation about business and creativity aren't two different conversations. I think Mother's known for hopefully a high level of creativity and a certain kind of provocative and audacious creativity, but it's never at the expense of the business outcomes that our clients need. And in fact, it's for the sake of that. And I felt like Ogilvy spent so much time being defensive about the business side of it. So they, like they over articulated that. And there's plenty of agencies that are too defensive about the creative side of it, and they over articulate on the other side. And that's what I love about Mother. And I think that's what I brought with me, was like, oh, I believe in them both. And I don't think one needs to justify the other. And I think you have to do it. And I think that gets to a lot of the work that we've been doing at Ogilvy, which is building out just an understanding of what's the growth audience, what does it need to move them? How do you create ideas that nobody else can think of in order to help move them, et cetera. The other part, I think, though, Jeffrey, is that entrepreneurialness of it, because I do, whether it's your offering or another offering in a publicly held company that's client driven, and especially at that point working for Martin Sorrell, who needed his his margin
Yep.
quarterly. You have to find that balance of taking risks, right? That's sort of like, it's like you kind of had to do it at night. We kind of had to prove it out. You kind of have to make the bet that it will work. And then hope that it does, and then invest and grow, or not. And so I think credit to Seifert and the organization. They were willing to take risks, and start to expand some things and see if they were there, across the board, but including your thing. And I think that's whatever, that sort of risk taking, and expansion is just something I've continued with me. But again, in a privately held organization, what's powerful about that is we've got more leeway.
Mm-hmm.
To take more risks and to try new things and to expand new things, or hire different kinds of people, or start different kinds of offerings, because we don't have to kick a certain percentage back to the public markets and or a holding company, and we can intersperse our values with our activities,
Mm-hmm.
with a little bit more breathing room, because we're controlling our own P&L and nobody's controlling it for us.
Gotcha. No, that's a great description in terms of the comparison between the two, and now that you've spent some time at Mother with the types of clients that you guys have, and the tension has continued to rise as it relates to the new majority, the shifting in terms of demographics, and then you take a look at the industry. Would you say the industry has moved forward or backwards when it comes to having a better understanding for the total addressable audience?
It's a good question. I think I'm going to give you a bad answer, which is it's both, right? It's like climbing Everest. It moves like 3 steps forward, then slips 2 steps back, and then goes 3 forward. So it's definitely moved forward in that I think the acceptance of the need to be more acute, more broadly and culturally, to both be hiring the people and to be doing the things that we do in terms of developing research, doing creative, talking to people. We know that it needs to become more inclusive. I think, the industry in general has taken steps to make it more inclusive. And I think especially in the wake of, George Floyd, there was just a phenomenal amount of pressure that was rightly put in order to make people prioritize things in the right way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's all good. I do think there is a little bit of maybe a slip back, both in terms of, again, it's a point you've made early on, which is just attaching a sports figure to your campaign in order to connect with an audience isn't really understanding what it is that they need, and addressing it in a way that has depth and richness. And that, and I think, your other thing too is about like actually changing the nature. I mean, this is your practice now in your current business. It's like changing the nature of the way that you operate internally as a corporation in order to make those changes intrinsic to the way you're structured and incentivized and sustain the organization. And I think that's a little bit because I whatever, and this is a hot topic and I'm going to say this in the wrong way, so keep me honest, but I do. The thing about your practice at Ogilvy versus having a DE in office is that you were bringing it into the fabric of the organization, and you were saying, in a lot of ways, hey, these hard conversations should be brought into the mainstream of the operation of the businesses, and not necessarily put into a
separate bucket. Yeah.
A separate bucket. And I know Adweek was just running a bunch of articles this week. And I know actually coming out of AdColor last week, where I think the theme was like, oh, there's been a sort of a pullback from sort of the heightened intensity post George Floyd.
Yeah.
And I agree with that because people are getting rid of their DE&I departments. But what I would love for people to study, though, is because I think what we've been trying to do at Mother is we've been trying to build it into the fabric and not make it a separate department, but actually make it a obligation,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, to think about every day and the way that you run the production department and the way that you source your, our vendors in production and the way that we actually look at the people who the production department is hiring and the way that we're hiring creatives and actually the places that we go to hire creatives. And you know what I mean? Like every person who runs a business at Mother needs to be responsible for that. And whether or not that pressure is being applied at the same degree, and maybe pressure is the wrong word, but the intensity of the ability behind it is the same now as it was 4 years ago. That's a good debate to be had. But I do like that it's, at least in some places, has been baked into the organization more. Though I think probably Mother is slightly unique. I think if you're a publicly held company and you just have the pressures of margin in a changing business with AI, the foot has been brought off the pedal.
Yeah. No. Would love to get in a conversation about DE&I, but we're not going to do that for this.
Sorry.
No, it's great. Look, I think, one of the reasons for revisiting this for our, next year would be 10 years, was to really, not that I'm comparing myself. Malcolm Gladwell has a new book out, and he goes back and, take a look at his book around, what is the name of the book? I'm going blank now. About the 100,000 hours, the all the examples that he gave in terms of what people have to do in terms of excellence and impact. The thing with this book is that, whether you are anti-change or pro-change from the industry standpoint, the practice that we're so wedded to, right? The question becomes, when there's a new thought or new thinking, what I've found is that people kind of retract back to what they're comfortable with on both sides, right? It was the Outliers. It's the book that he's going back and say, hey, I got this wrong. He had the freedom to kind of do that, right? My hope is, we publish a playbook. Some parts needs to be updated, but the other part to this is that we as an industry have to kind of reflect, but not reflect, using these same approaches. But hey, it was this new thing. A lot of pushback. We moved forward, but we took some step back. What do we need to change, even within the new approach, to reflect?
Well, and if you, I don't want to blow your lead out if you want to wrap it up, but I'll maybe even to end on a or at least here's what I think is good is we definitely, Target was a good client of ours for a long time. And they have a very, diverse audience, and at the time, especially for their style audience, the Hispanic element was, significant. And they'd had a Hispanic agency that was doing all of their work. And we eventually, and I feel bad about it, but we actually rolled all of that work up into Mother because we had Hispanic strategists, we had Hispanic creatives. We would do specific work to then go understand that audience, but understand that audience again in connection to all of the other audiences, because it was it's a very broad and diverse audience, and then create advertising that I think was, I always thought of you. It was sort of like on brief for you because it was sort of a general market advertising, but influenced by the depth of the insights of everybody who we had to connect with. And sometimes we would go make ads just for an audience, either a Black audience or Hispanic audience, or even a LGBTQ plus audience. But then most of that time, that was just like, like looking them in the eye and just saying like, hey, like, we got you, like, we hear you, we see you, as opposed to the business building work, which is just like saying like, oh, but we also want you to think about our brand in this way. And I think that that's continued. And I here's my other like hopeful thing to what you were just saying in terms of the step forward, in addition to, because I agree with you, like there's actually a lot of great agencies now doing purely multicultural work, and good for them. And they're doing a good business. But I agree with you. Like, I don't love siloing it out. I do think like the word culture itself, not in the Jeffrey Bowman term, but in a sort of like code for connecting with diverse audiences, has sort of become its own thing and has become a little bit like over accentuated. But I do know that, I mean, we've won 2 massive businesses in the last 4 months who have very dynamic multicultural growth audiences that are part of their general market. It's like literally their growth.
Right. It is their market. Yeah.
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 And they've hired us because we've come to them as Mother with our usual sense of youthfulness, forward-looking, progressive and ambitious creative. And one is a big financial services company that knows that they have to connect with a new generation of investors who have completely different attitudes. And one is a big packaged goods company that knows that they've got to continue to drive, CPG onto breakfast tables. But they know that the cross-cultural component of it, but they also know that that's part of the core brief. And I think, whatever, I'm not perfect at all. It's a never-ending quest, but I do believe we've continued to staff ourselves with, the diversity of people and perspective and experiences, both creatively and strategically, and even on the account side, that, part of the reason we've been able to win these businesses, because they look at us as much as they're massive publicly held industrial companies, but they've been like, okay, those guys can help us with that. And you know what I mean? And that's partially why we want them. So I do think that it's a slow sign though, Jeffrey, of your thinking sort of creeping into the mainstream.
What I'm excited about and what I just heard from you in terms of example that you gave is that it always goes back to talent. You can have the box of general market multicultural, but if you have a talent that reflects the market that you serve, you're able to actually execute the cross-cultural approach. Or, now we've got this new polycultural approach, and that's another conversation in terms of what I think about that. But no, I want to thank you for coming on and, in a safe space, sharing not only our journey, but your journey in terms of where you started and how you transitioned, and you jumped ship on a few people and then went over the Mother and doing amazing stuff as a chief strategy officer. So is there anything else you'd like to, leave with us before we exit?
No, I mean, other than thanks for having me. It's always energizing talking to you. And it's oddly, it's been a really propitious time, I think, even just for me to have been not forced, but to be catalyzed to go back and think about history a little bit, and to just, prepare for this conversation and dig up all of those old memories. Because I think there's a lot of things that both you and I wanted to do and we're doing and we're trying to do. It was just good to reflect on those themes, even now, as I sort of, think about what's going on and what I'm trying to even still get done at Mother. So thank you for that.
Well, we thank you for coming on, and let's continue to drive impact and be a catalyst for change. Thank you.
Thank you.